Okay, so we're going to have a little chat about hybrid working, the hybrid workplace. I think most people have come to the conclusion that it is here to stay, despite maybe some of our political friends telling us all to go back to the office, etc. But I think we kind of worked out that hybrid is the future. The pandemic probably didn't start it, but it certainly accelerated the move for obvious reasons. But I guess partly because of that, it's a sort of slightly accidental start to hybrid working for a lot of companies, and it needs to be formalized. So we're maybe at the start of hybrid working 2.0, if that's what we call. So yeah, can you just, I guess, flesh out?
And I think that's exactly a good description. And I have very similar thought processes where we're at a situation where in 2020, when we were all told to work from home, it was just get everybody working from home. Certain things that would normally not have been implemented, security, were lax, the ability, like we used to have a policy, hey, everybody's going to change their password at least once a month, and it would go through and rotate and stuff. And all of that stuff, when everybody's working from home, the IT guys just let it slide, if that makes sense, just to enable that. At the same time, we've all grown used to disruptions, poor internet connections, connectivity problems, etc. And as we move into this next phase, it's all about building a more, I wouldn't say professional, but a more robust infrastructure in the houses that support hybrid working. It's more about, I can talk about it from my own instance. I have a fairly stabilized VDSL line that comes into the house, but the number of times when my wife and kids are home saying, "Oh, but this is going on. How do you do it?" And I'm in the middle of a meeting, and we've all got to drop what we do and I've got to go and try to fix it so that I can carry on doing what I've been working on. So I'm looking at putting in different types of infrastructure. So I've got a wired connection. I'm putting a 5G modem on the outside, connecting it in to give me failover and resiliency in case one or other lines are going in. And at the same time, adding things like security and other more robust precautions into the infrastructure, VPN. So instead of running VPNs on devices, putting it into dedicated devices that are doing physical connections, if that makes sense, as opposed to running it on machines. So that gives longevity, because all of that infrastructure that goes into the home has a cost. And a lot of businesses have struggled, not just because of COVID, but because of component shortage and all the negativity, the pound shrinking, the cost of living, all of those things have to be paid for. So how can you do that? You put infrastructure in, there's a price to be paid for that infrastructure. So simple way, keep your hardware and your IT equipment for longer periods of time. By offloading it in, becoming semi-permanent, at least you get a bit more use out of the equipment that you're using. Nobody would have thought that we'd be on video calls, at 7-8 hours a day, but that's what we're doing now. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. And in terms, I suppose, of the check, you've alluded to some of the things that have changed, things going on. But I mean, starting maybe with the basics. I mean, a lot of us, I suppose, some people didn't have a choice. If they're working in a flat with 7 other people, they probably had to sit on the end of their bed. But I guess a lot of us have started sitting at the dining room table, but maybe not done anything since then. That's possibly not the best, ergonomic place to be, etc. So that's, again, budgets allowing, space allowing, that's a good starting point just to make your environment comfortable.
It was phenomenal when I look at the staff that we've got, and we work in a very diverse environment. We've got very young guys, very old guys, people from abroad, as well as locals. And one of the guys used to work for me, and he was saying, "Look, I can work at the dining room table, but that guy's too noisy. So I want to go and do this." And the companies have made him. I know we did. We made investments in allowing the guys to get desks in the rooms, setting them up with monitor stands, setting them up with keyboards if they wanted keyboards, etc., in order to give them a more appropriate viewpoint. For my guys, since we've been back, we're working hybrid, 3 days at home, 2 days in the office. I've done an audit with each one of my guys in order to make sure that they have the appropriate equipment to do the hybrid working. Have they got do they need monitors? Do they need printers? Do they need keyboards, mice, etc., etc.? Just are they sitting in an environment where they are ergonomically comfortable rather than long term? Because it's one thing to control the atmosphere in an office where people are coming in, you give them desks, you give them monitors, you give them, you do pat tests, for example. I mean, this is just like a random thought process, but what do you do for pat test? You do it in the office, but these guys are spending 60% of their time working from home. So we're defining and evolving our processes in order to try to comply with their own health and safety, but also to make sure that we get the most out of these guys. Most people tend to work a lot harder at home because they're taking less breaks. They're wandering around. There's no cooler chat. That to me is the downside of hybrid working. We've looked at, and whilst I like hybrid working, I can see the benefits of it. I also miss the social interaction of being in the office, and it's not related to work, but it's just the banter and the social interaction that you get from being around colleagues. We've looked to hire some graduates, and the graduates' expectation is I'm going to be based from home 5 days a week. Okay, how are you going to learn the ropes? How do you pass on knowledge? How do you, because it's impossible. I mean, it makes it very difficult to interact over an electronic medium unless you're on it all the time. And you don't. I'm not one of those bosses that's going to be pinging somebody and who's a marionette type of boss, But it's those sort of things that I think we as a company are beginning to figure out ourselves, and getting people inducted into the culture of the company, because that's a very important sort of ethic and a driving force in our organization, that everybody understands who we are, what we stand for, the values, etc. We're not a large company in the grand scheme of things, but that's an important thing for us.
And in terms of I mean, as you say, we're communicating today over Zoom. It could have been Teams or one of the other platforms. Yeah. I mean, that's a huge, great thing. I mean, I know video conferencing has been around since, quite a while. The early days, it maybe wasn't too clever. I mean, clearly the digital tools are very good these days. But again, do you think people, it's very easy just to switch it on, talk to someone, shut it down. Do you think a lot of people need to understand more about those tools, and there's maybe many other things that, I always think it's a bit like
they're all evolving. Nobody knew Zoom before lockdown, and you sort of think, yeah, it's great. But we started off lockdown on Google and Google Suite. We've migrated since then onto Teams. Teams has just brought a level of complexity that a lot of us haven't even figured out how to use it, what are the capabilities, etc. I'm absolutely bored with the plethora of apps that I need to download in order to maintain it. It's like if you don't use Zoom, Teams, or Hangout, you're buggered, because you're going to have to download WebEx, go to meeting, go to webinar, and so each one has got their own application, and you may only need it once, or a company is using this particular tool, but it's sitting there doing, and they're all sharing the same core assets, the camera and the speakers in your system, etc. And it causes huge issues if you get let's say a less well-behaved app. Most of these, if you look at Zoom, Teams, Hangout. The three of them work quite well. You use one and then flick to another and flick to the other, and they don't have it. But I've experienced problems where, for example, the mic is gone, or the video camera's gone, and I'm obliged to be on the call and be visible, and I can't be visible because the camera's gone. So you get the whole thing, oh, hold on, I'm going to reboot the machine, and you go through that. So I think that's quite a challenge. And I think if hybrid working is going to evolve, it would be nice to be able to have let's call it a standardized app that had plugins for the different companies, so that it means less training, it means simpler usage, etc. If you're using FaceTime or whatever, the built-in apps in a Mac, for example, at least you've got the core functionality built into the OS, and everything else jumps into it. It'd be nice to see that, but I think it would probably kill some of the creativity in the software development that if we went down that road, unfortunately.
And I mean, do you think expectations are a bit higher now as well? Because I think, certainly from my own experience, in the early days, everyone was kind of learning together. Yeah. And if things went a bit wrong, then, it was, I won't say it was entertaining, but, we were all fairly sympathetic. Whereas now, perhaps we are back to business mode. So, if something doesn't work, we're less tolerant. Someone says, oh, I've got a bad connection. We're like, well, you shouldn't have, kind of thing. Is that fair to say? Yeah,
I think that's absolutely right. I think most of the expectation is that all the teething problems have been ironed out, and it should, this stuff shouldn't work. But I mean, last week I was, I'd had a Zoom call, dropped off the Zoom call, and then suddenly I couldn't have team calls with the people which meant, like most of us, you've got one call, I'm backed up, and the camera didn't work, and I was in the middle of the call, but I couldn't drop off the call. But in order for it to work, I ended up having to reboot. But of course, everything I was working on had to be saved and then reboot. We've all been through those sort of times, but it's stressful. It's a different kind of stress, if that makes sense, because you sit there going, why is that not working? It was working earlier, but people, the expectation is higher. You're not expected to have technical problems. I mean, that's the key thing. But at the same time, having technical problems is very, very difficult. My wife's company, just anecdotally, they went into cloud. They've done hybrid working, and they've got to a point where they go, right, here's your new computer. Click, plug it in, go through the screen. Dell will preload an image, it connects, it downloads all the apps, installs all the stuff, etc. Great. I mean, literally, the computer was built in our house, connected, and away it goes, and she was working. However, last week she'd come back, plugged it in, and she couldn't send mails. Outlet kept crashing. At that point, she doesn't know what to do. The IT guys were like, oh, I don't know. And she was lucky because she managed to get somebody at 7 o'clock in order who managed to get her up and running. But then he said, you need to bring it in. And it required a physical visit in order to do that. Now, with hybrid working, it has some benefits, but it has some huge pitfalls. Because as you've got this urban flight that's going on, and your office is maybe in, for example, London or Manchester, but you've decided you're going to live in Derbyshire. I mean, are you going to make that trip into the office just so that the IT guy can look at it for 5 minutes and do this? Because people essentially don't want to make those kind of trips out of their legitimate trades, if that makes sense, and I think this is an area where companies are, shall we say, not yet caught up with the hybrid working. How do you do support? How can you do this if you can't physically connect to those devices? IT departments, if IT departments have the same hybrid working model, where are you going to take the equipment? You know, it has some very nominal effect on how companies consider working, the policies. And it's also things like working from home and the impact of insurance and health, right? I mean, you've suddenly got all the equipment. Well, companies are geared up to, if anything gets lost, it's going to be in the house. You're working from home now. If you've got a £1,000 computer, have you declared it on the insurance policy? Do you need to declare it on your insurance policy? Are you covered? And I know that sounds like a bit sort of outlandish, but I know from dealing with insurance companies through other things that any of these kind of right field things that can be thrown in, well, it's not your computer, it's not your computer, it's a work computer, blah blah blah, can be used in order to do this. But the responsibility is on you as an individual to make sure that you're protecting the assets. And you never know, you know, those are the things that I think companies have to look at to see if they've actually provided that level of cover to the employees. Because if otherwise, you know, I can see companies turning around saying, well, it was on your premises, you're responsible for it, you need to make sure that it was there. And if it isn't covered, then who's going to be responsible? You know, I mean, it's again, it's a much bigger topic. You know, I think a lot of people just say, oh, I'm just going to be based from home and I'm just going to, but it's a much more holistic approach that has to be taken in making sure that happens.
Yeah, and I guess on a similar note, the whole connectivity, I imagine most people just, you know, assuming they had Wi-Fi in the house, just locked into that. And as you say, then when the children wanted to play on the PlayStation or whatever it was, etc., it all got a little bit sort of sticky. I would imagine that at the very least you need a dedicated, you know, office line alongside whatever's being used for recreation. But also, I mean, there's Wi-Fi 6 and mesh extender. So what sort of things do people need to look at around connectivity?
I think there's a few things that come about now. The first thing is that a decent router and a decent speed. So you're going to maximize the speed. One of the things that we ended up doing was create the cost of a dedicated line. Unless the company's going to pay for a dedicated line or a dedicated speed, you're going to have a problem. We had during lockdown, we saw a great deal of business from our side where companies were providing employees with MiFi devices, so 5G, 4G dongles that they could plug into the machines, running VPNs, so that they could have that connectivity. In a wired environment, we ended up setting, like in my house, we ended up setting restrictions so that no device could consume the bandwidth of the network. So no device could actually take more than a certain percentage of that network. Over that period, so as we've become more accustomed, we've begun to get mesh systems coming into the property, but you still have the same requirement. You need to have control over that bandwidth, segmenting the network, you know, so that the wireless is not completely consumed by a device that is just hogging all the bandwidth. So creating, you've paid your money, you've got yourself a mesh system, create a dedicated Wi-Fi signal for it. Keep it independent, so VLAN it if your router supports it, so that you can have a dedicated work line. You know, have a separate line. These things are very much becoming the norm. You know, there were having a guest network. People tend to put it in, but most routers tend to have a guest network. Having a dedicated IoT network for let's call it smart home devices in the home, keeping them separated from the other devices in case one of those is not behaving as you would expect, and then having a dedicated work line. So that's 3 SSIDs, which most of these devices can support, but it's worth going in and trying to put those kind of implement those kind of network design in the home that will help maintain the existing thing. If your company's willing to put an extra line in or give you a Wi-Fi, brilliant, you know, and that's kind of what I'm doing is I'm getting a 5G modem, putting it on the outside of the house, connecting, and then I'm failing over between the two. So if one line is full, it will go out the other line or vice versa. So looking at it like that, it's critical to understand where is the bottleneck. Is it the Wi-Fi in the house? Or is it the line that comes into the house? Most of the time, it's something in the house that stops you getting the optimum speed, because most of our houses are made of brick, mortar. You know, you may have flint. You may have, we have water heaters. You put it. Water is a great blocker of radio signals. So where you position the devices and that kind of stuff can affect those devices. And I think people have just put stuff around, but sometimes just repositioning existing equipment could improve the whole home network or the home Wi-Fi experience significantly just by making a few tweaks. I don't know if that sort of kind of.
Yeah.
I was just going
to. Sorry, yeah.
Sorry, Phil. I was just going to jump in from a UK perspective specifically. One of the things that I did way back in June in 2020 was something called the Remote Working Guide, which we're still using today. Gets updated every year as we get new products. And the whole goal behind that was to create a very simple 10-page PDF which talked through all the ways that people could improve their home Wi-Fi. Some of the ways that Neil had just said. Nobody considers if I put my router next to the fish tank, it's going to absorb the signal. And talking about antenna positioning and also using our own portfolio to go out and tell people, look, we have these products. You know, the perception of D-Link might be somebody has a D-Link router, somebody has a D-Link switch, but we also do USB-C hubs, which have been a great use, real growth in that kind of area for people at home. You don't want a big docking station, 150 pounds. Well, these little USB-C devices, I'm using one right here, allow me to connect all of these extra ports. Somebody's gone home with their Macintosh. They're used to having a lovely docking station in the office. They've got an ultra portable, but they've got no USB slots and they can't connect their mouse or anything like that. So that was one of the things that we did as a UK team, was just go out, get this done. And then after the remote working guide, going a little bit more in depth with why upgrade your router. You mentioned Wi-Fi 6. The European team did some great stuff on Wi-Fi 6 for business and Wi-Fi 6 at home. We went a little bit further and went with a real beginner's guide. Do you know how old your router is? Asking people questions like that. So a lot of what we did through the pandemic was trying to inform, be educational without costing people too much. Those cost-effective tips that you can use your equipment, but then maybe realize that your router is 10 years old and it might just be time to upgrade.
I think that's a pretty good point as well, particularly with regards to the home, what's going on typically in the UK at the moment. If you look at fiber to the home is currently the mantra. You know, you're seeing lots and lots of small telcos popping up, you know, digging up your road, running fiber down the road and providing you connectivity. And this is going to fundamentally change. And I think this is where we have to look, not just hybrid working, but how we look at a home network. Because if you think about it, the average consumer in the UK will simply just take the router that they get from the ISP, plug it in and use it. Right? That router could be 2-3 generations, and the attitude is it's not broken, it's working, so I'll continue to do this. But you don't get the enhancements in the speed, you don't get the enhancements in the Wi-Fi, etc. But if you, for example, swap one out, swap another one in, you've then got the whole issue of the Wi-Fi network and the Wi-Fi password and everything being completely wrong. You know, if you've ever tried trying to program changing the SSID or the password on an Alexa, and you tried doing it click, 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 it's a pain in the ass. So it's really key is to try to think about, my advice to any consumer would be is, look, think about your network, create an SSID, Neil, that's it. Okay, Neil's Wi-Fi, that's my Wi-Fi. Give it that unique name, connect to all of those devices, give it quite a complex password, but just give it a password. And then if you get a new router or you get a new device, you take those credentials and you put them into the new device. So you don't need to reprogram anything. It makes it easier for you. Alternatively, if you've got a mesh, or like I went down the route of, well, actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to run cables. I had the fatal mistake during lockdown where my daughter, who was in the back bedroom, she fell off the Wi-Fi. Her phone fell back to 4G, and she ran up a £200 telephone bill. And I was like, wow. So, and she went, Dad, honestly, I wasn't, yeah. And in the end, what I ended up doing was hardwiring access points. So I ran a cable up the side of the house, I put one in the loft, I put one downstairs. That I run my own Wi-Fi signal, and I simply just plug into the router. And I don't use, the router is nothing more than my connection to the internet. I don't use it for anything. And that has just improved the wireless immensely. For somebody who's maybe not as technical, they can just get a whole home mesh system and put that into place and use it in the same way. But that's, as we move to fiber, that's what we're going to have to do. But it's something that will be down to each individual in order to do that. And I think it's now time to look and say, well, how would you do it in a small company? And is it time that you build that in? Because security is going to become even more important at home as because you've got these devices, you know, thermostats, smart plugs, light bulbs that are connected and they're in your home. You have no idea how stable they are, if they've been patched, or, you know, how many people do firmware updates and stuff. If you're in the office, your IT guys are doing all the security stuff, patching your computers and doing. If you're at home, who else is doing it? Nobody's doing it. And those things are going to be, shall we say, in my eyes, are the pitfalls of hybrid working, because those are environments that companies and IT staff can't legislate or control. So those are things that will, I think the burden will fall on people doing hybrid working to make sure that they do this stuff. I mean, yeah, again, young kids, oh, I haven't taken the latest iOS patch. Why haven't you taken the patch? Well, I didn't want to do it. Do it. Take the patch, take the fix, go ahead and, you know, and it's about getting into that discipline of doing it. You know, it may introduce some problems, but it will probably stop you having problems in the long run, if that makes sense. And that's where I see the biggest threat.
I was going to say security. I mean, for everything from, I suppose, just, you know, you're at home, you're maybe not quite as, you know, on your guard as you might have been in an office. So, I mean, even just the sort of basics sort of around phishing and stuff like that,
yeah,
that's the most simple thing. But as you say, then you've got the whole, you know, do you use a VPN? And then, as you say, if you've got all these smart devices in your house and they're all going via, you know, one wireless network, then there's a whole potential world of pain there. So, as you say, it sounds like your company's probably not going to send somebody out to everybody's home to sort it out.
No.
How do you've alluded to a bit, but how do you think people can manage that? Is it easy enough to explain to employees and coach them and sit alongside them to do it all, or how do you see that?
I think a lot of that will be in a handful of ways. I mean, I think coaching is one. I think the guides and stuff that we've produced that kind of say, look, these are the best practices, right? Go ahead and do these best practices. Make sure that you do them. Now, you can't, because these are people's homes as well, right? So there's no actual compunction. There's no way that you can force people to follow the rules. You can advise, you can make sure, but then you have to indemnify yourself in case anything happens as a result of it, right? And who's on the hook? That's what I was trying to allude to. If anything goes wrong, it's going to be on the individual who's based from home. So you've got to follow those rules, right? Segment the record, keep everything that's there, do it. And if you look at a lot of, I mean, we do a lot of stuff, and this is how we recommend anyway: segment the networks. Because to use an analogy, your Wi-Fi is like a motorway, and what you do in each lane of the motorway, what you're doing is you're putting a particular piece of traffic. Now, the key difference is you don't let that traffic move into another lane; it just stays in that lane. So most of these smart home devices, in theory, are slow moving to traffic. They don't use a lot of traffic, except turn me on, turn me off sort of thing. So they're not high bandwidth usage. But if you get a delinquent that's in that lane that's going super, super fast, he could be doing anything, if you know what I mean. He's being a bit rowdy. If you're working, you want to have your own lane so that it's absolutely clear for your work traffic or for business related traffic. And you want to make sure that that lane is secure so that nothing can cross into it. Because if anything can get into it, you may compromise security as a result of it. So from a consumer perspective, it's absolutely key that these kind of messages are conveyed as a part of the hybrid working and home working message that people do it. Because companies will, the alternative is, companies will go and say, right, here is your dedicated company network. You can only use company in, you'll have to have two of everything, a personal network and a private network. And I think that our infrastructure can't handle double of everything, if that makes sense. I don't think it makes sense. It can be sorted, but it's discipline. And I think as well, people have become a lot more tech savvy working from home, if that makes sense.
And I mean, is it at all practical? Obviously, the IT department at the moment monitors networks, and if users are working remotely. Do you think it's practical? And I know there are obviously some issues around privacy, but that you could extend that monitoring into your employees' environments, or is that just a no from that privacy point of view? Or
I think it's a no, but I think it's a market. It's an opportunity. Companies that do the monitoring software and all this kind of stuff, I think what I feel happens is, if you take your company network and your company designs before, I'm old enough to remember when the internet was only in the office and it was permanently connected. And if I wanted to connect to the internet, I had to connect it to a telephone line, and it was an on-demand system. I've seen us go from that to permanent connection. And that permanent connection has meant that I've now got a firewall at home built into my router. And the speeds that I get at home now track behind the speeds that I used to have at home. So what I see is a trend in that applications and technology that is used in business eventually migrates its way into a consumer environment. And what I feel will happen over the next 3-5 years is you're going to see the tools that they use for monitoring and checking that stuff in the office being, let's call it, simplified, stripped out, etc., being consumerized, so that you can get tools that will allow you to check this stuff and patch your stuff on the network, and it will be done. And I can see those technologies being included in things like the routers and all of that kind of stuff, so that we do it. And we had a router a couple of years ago that did just that sort of thing. You know, it would go out, it would check to see what the firmware revisions were of all the devices on the network that it discovered, if they were up to date or not up to date, and it would prompt you, do you want to do this? You could turn it off, but it was a bit it was a bit processor intensive. But that type of functionality, shall we say, is the future of what I consider to be the home, but also more suited to the hybrid working, if that makes sense.
Yeah, okay. I mean, we covered a lot of ground, and I would imagine a lot of people watching, listening, will think a lot of this makes a great sense, but they will be in that sort of, you know, we did it sort of ad hoc to start with. We now do need to formalize it. And you said, obviously, yourselves, you've done a lot of work, great guys and stuff. I mean, are there any one or two bits of advice you'd give to people? Because as I say, you know, there's an awful lot from the, you know, just the simple making sure you're comfortable at home in your office to, you know, getting yourself sorted with the right digital tools, security. Yeah, do you just start very small and build up? Teach each employee differently depending on, you know, how savvy you think they are? Where do you go?
Yeah, there was a survey I read a couple of years ago, which and what it is it's about the individual. There's like one individual in an office who saves the company, and I remember it was something like 30%, because what it is that they're tech savvy. If that makes sense, right? They do the support on how do I do this? How do I use V lookups? How do I use X lookups? And they sort of train different people because they're like a paragon of knowledge. You've got IT staff and training departments, but people don't do it. You know, there's one individual. So I think finding the easiest way of doing it is to find and create blueprints and templates that people can follow. Does that make sense? So our recommendation is go ahead and have this type of configuration within your network if you can achieve it. Look, Joe over there, or, you know, Alan's done it in his house like this. Why don't you try to do the same? This is how we recommend you do it. If you've got a question, you can come to me or you can go to Alan. He'll tell you. And what happens is that whole evolution, that whole change is the way to do it. It's to find, we call it, you know, finding those technology ambassadors. That's probably a good in your company that you can use as pillars and say, look, that's what you do it. This is what he's done. These are the benefits. This is what we want you to do. And then slowly but surely, you can get to that point. You can achieve the same thing because in the UK, you know, you've got 3 or 4 ISPs that are the main providers for home networking, BT being the biggest. If you take BT and you sort of say, this is how you would do it on a BT hub, blah, 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 create the instructions and then share them with the staff. So you've got somebody who's done it, there's the instructions, and they would easily be transferable to everybody else. It's just, it's tell them and again, you know, and it's about that whole, it's a journey. It will be a journey. You've just got to hope that you don't get caught out in the meantime. Or the company doesn't get caught out in the meantime.
That's brilliant. I mean, it's been really great to chat to both today. So I appreciate your time. Thanks very much, Jens. Thank you indeed.